Test, test. All right, the food was taking a little bit longer than we expected, so we're going to go ahead and call Professor Smith up.
Well, this is going to be interesting. I don't usually speak over waiters and so forth coming in for the food, but we'll have food for thought for a few minutes. And it's not nearly as fattening, but probably not as filling either. Great to be with you, and I commend you for the society that's here, for the purposes that you have joined together to promote through the Federalist Society. I know that not all of you are members of that group. We have some family members of people who are members. We have some friends and so forth, and welcome all of you here. This book that I'll be speaking about to some extent arises out of my living in England for it used to be 6 months a year. I had a really good deal with the law school out at Pepperdine. Asked the dean if I could take off a couple of times on a leave of absence and a sabbatical, and I went to England, loved it over there. And I said, could I do it again one year? And he said, well, we can't just keep doing this unless you do it every year. And then he tried to talk me into doing both semesters off every year. I don't know what the message was there, but bar results at Pepperdine skyrocketed after I started teaching only half a year. And I don't know what that says either. But really interesting career as a law professor, which I had never dreamed about doing or thought that I might do, but ended up doing that. And I must say that I've been an extremely successful law professor. If you look at some of my former students, for example, Rob Blagojevich. I taught Blago everything he knows, which is why he's in prison today. So I can't speak much on behalf of the products that I've produced. And actually, we have a product of Jones School of Law here today. Aaron Wiley, raise your hand. But I didn't taint him at all. He's Professor Smith free. Because I didn't come until last year as a visitor, and he'd already gone through. And if you don't know him, you need to know him. We need to get him a job, by the way. If you know someplace where he's a good man, so we need to get.
The bar, too.
You just passed the bar, absolutely. Yeah, and I hesitate to mention that Jones School of Law for the last summer bar beat out everybody, including Judge Robertson, Alabama on the bar. So let's hear it for Jones School of Law. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. This book, let me get to it in a very cursory way, because really my comments are going to be directed elsewhere than the book itself. The first purpose of the book is to show how a culture very much like our own, the British culture, has rapidly devolved into a tyrannous state in which individual freedoms have rapidly vanished under the leadership of all three major parties. It hardly matters. It started with Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and now David Cameron. It just hardly matters. The regulatory hyper-nanny state just keeps rolling on down the road. The second purpose of the book was to drill down to the underlying causes of the paradigm shift that I've witnessed in England over the past 25 years. And I want to offer some suggestions as to maybe why fundamental freedoms have suddenly just dropped out of the bottom. The third purpose is to obviously warn about the trajectory that we're on here in America. That this movement's coming across the pond so rapidly we just don't have a clue as to what's about to hit us over here. And under the current liberal left leadership of Obama and others around him, we are in deep trouble, I believe. I want to make a quick confession that I've never made on any of the books that I've written. I've always been really, really excited about the books that I've written. This is one I'm not terribly excited about. I'm not going to tell you the whole long story, but it started off as one book and ended up as another. So it is not a page turner. If you have difficulty sleeping at night, read a few pages, it'll put you right out. The main strength of this book is that it contains scores of news articles that I gleaned from the newspapers in Britain. The point being that I wanted to document this loss of freedoms And I thought, I just hadn't seen that anywhere else. It's in the papers in Britain all the time, but over here we just don't see that. By the way, I suggest to you a really good website, the Daily Telegraph, one of the best papers in the world. But you can go online and get the Daily Telegraph, and if you want to keep up with what's going on the other side of the pond in Europe and Britain, Daily Telegraph, that's the place to see. They don't give all of the little reports that I have included in the book on the website, but it'll give you some idea. And that's the strength of the book, if it really has one, plus the drilling down to the underlying issues that we often miss. The freedoms that have been lost that I catalog in the book, I'm just going to really run through these because I like you too much to scare you at lunch. But the parent-child relationship, for instance, I don't know about the rest of you, but I got spanked by my parents when I grew up, and I think it didn't do me any harm. I think it did me a lot of good. Well, in England today, the police knock at your door if there's any evidence of parents spanking their children. Homeschoolers are presumed to be abusing their children physically and mentally because, after all, they are psychologically abusing their children by teaching them about God. Most homeschoolers are teaching about God, and they don't want that. Schools are texting 11-year-olds about the morning after pill, that it's available, and they do not tell the parents they're texting the children. That's what's happening with the parental thing. As we're speaking of schools, education, even faith-based schools are being forced to teach about contraceptives, a non-judgmental view of homosexuality, and that amoeba to man, macro, capital E evolution is just beyond all dispute. And so you can say in a faith-based school, children, God created the heavens and the earth, but by the way, here's how he did it, which is kind of interesting. And you really shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, but here's how you use a condom. You know, it's nuts over there. The government, through its vaunted National Health Service, a la Obamacare on the other side of the pond, encourages teens to experiment with sex even while lamenting teen pregnancy and skyrocketing STDs. Now go figure. Despite time-honored religious education classes in even the state schools, one 5-year-old recently was told by the equivalent of a principal in this country. She was having a conversation with a friend who asked her, now, how could a person go to hell? And the little 5-year-old said, by not believing in Jesus. And both the young 5-year-old and her mother, who worked at the school, were both chastised for this. The head of the school said it was okay for her to say that as long as she didn't say, now that is the truth. As long as it's an opinion, that's okay. The strangest thing I find in modern England and Wales and Scotland and so forth is that they have a pedophilia paranoia. It's unbelievable. Because it's a small country and anything kind of gets exaggerated over there, they had a few child abuse cases, so they just went nuts on this thing. Anyone having contact with under 18s must have a police background check. That means carpooling moms, babysitters, scout leaders, Sunday school teachers, student exchange parents, babysitters, a police background check, which means that a quarter of all adults in Britain and a whole bunch of under 18s themselves have to have police background checks.
And the good ones have a clean background.
Yes, and the good ones have a clean background, exactly. Thank you for that asterisk, because that's right. Parents without police clearance are banned from public play areas in parks. They have park rangers who have police background checks, but because you're a parent and don't have a police background check, you can't even go inside to swing your little child on the swings. Crazy. Photographs of children are verboten because you might be a pedophile. So if they see somebody taking a picture, particularly in a swimming pool area or a public park, on the beach or whatever, even normal people today have gone abnormal and they just go nuts and they say, put away that camera, you might be a pedophile. Health and safety, we just don't have a clue. It's coming here in the States. We got some engineers that would give us trouble on this too today, but health and safety assessments are required for even the most minor of activities. Scaffolding has to be used instead of ladders. If you use a ladder, you have to have a 2-day course to use one. Apparently I didn't. I almost fell off the other day. Only electricians are allowed to hang Christmas lights outside businesses. Santa Claus in the parade can't throw the traditional candy to the crowd. He's liable to hit somebody. Circus acrobats have to wear helmets. Clowns can't wear size 18 shoes. Firemen's poles are dangerous. We wouldn't want the firemen doing anything dangerous now, would we? Musicians at the pops must not exceed certain decibels. So those cornet players, they're the loudest. Got to watch those folks. School children are barred from traditional activities even if there's a slight risk of injury. It's a risk-averse society that you cannot believe. Kids are growing up in a cocoon, and they just aren't learning to be challenged by risk. And here's one that starts us into another neck of the woods over in Britain, and that is that Bibles have been removed from hospitals because they might spread the superbug. And they have a lot of superbug over in the National Health Service, which is Obamacare on the other side of the pond. But interestingly enough, and this is a backstory as well, it's okay to have copies of the Quran, because that obviously doesn't spread the superbug. In terms of a police state, it's a surveillance society in Britain with the most CCTV coverage of any nation. Local councils spy on citizens for not picking up dog waste, failing to recycle, putting garbage out early. They actually have in many of the local councils GPS chips in the wheelie bin out at the curb so they can monitor all these things. The police will randomly threaten even tourists photographing St. Paul's or Parliaments if they just don't like the look of a tourist. And everybody's clicking away because you're over there, you've been there, many of you have been there taking pictures of everything. You got to be really careful today, or if they don't like your looks, they'll bust you. And here's the one that's scary today. Just recently, teachers were asking if the children in the classroom knew of anyone who wasn't recycling, as in their parents. Enter Mao, stage left. And then, of course, the one that concerns me the most, just because of the kinds of books that I write and so forth, faith under fire. Wearing crosses to work is prohibited. Celebrated cases. A nurse wanted to wear a cross on a necklace underneath her uniform, and she was not allowed to, even underneath her uniform. There was a worker, employee of British Airways at Gatwick Airport. She got fired for wearing a cross on the job. Of course, all her Muslim employees were wearing their various kinds of religious headgear, but it was said that the cross is not the same thing. It's not. No Christian is required to wear a cross like a Muslim is required to wear a habib or something like that. Scouts are always under fire for pledging allegiance to God, and of course the ACLU over here has been after the Scouts for a long time. You know that nefarious outfit, the Scouts, they're just targets on their backs. It's strange. Some bed and breakfast owners were taken to court for refusing to accommodate a gay couple that came, and they were coming as a test case because on the website this couple said, we do not have accommodations for any unmarried couples, heterosexual or homosexual. In fact, the brother of this homeowner or this B&B was unmarried, had a girlfriend, and they said, you can't come and stay overnight because you're not married. So they weren't discriminating against anybody, but because they discriminate against gays, suddenly they get hauled into court. And they're up before the European Court of Human Rights today. Very strange. Just must be in the bed and breakfast business, because another couple who had a bed and breakfast were having a conversation with some Muslim guests, and they were hauled into court because they just made the statement that Muhammad was a warlord. Free speech in Britain has gone totally out the window. An elected official, local elected official who spoke out against homosexuality on a radio talk show, got a call after the show from the local police saying, you don't have a right to talk that way. And of course, as here at home, again with the ACLU leading the charge, but even more so in Britain, Christmas is threatened right, left, and center. And I just want to point this out, that by contrast, Muslims can and do say whatever they want and insist on special accommodation for dress, diet, and holidays. There's just something strange over there. Maybe it's they're just feel threatened because they've been the bombings over there by the Muslim and so forth. But it's also part of a liberal mindset. that we can tolerate anything Muslim, but we can't tolerate anything Christian. It's very odd, very, very odd. Now, the main premise of my book is what I really want to focus in on. The main premise is that hyperregulation, such as what I've just reviewed for you all too rapidly, and the loss of personal liberty results from Britain's breathtaking secularization. All of this is because of what's happening in the larger picture in terms of faith. Despite having an established church, which of course we founded this country partly because of we wanted to get away from an established church. And don't forget, we had established churches in the various colonies. It wasn't that we didn't want established churches. We didn't want one federal established church, such as the Church of England. But in any event, despite the fact that England has had a long history as having an established church and faith in the public square, Britain today has become a faithless Christian nation. And here's the quickest way to see this. If you take away Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and just look at England, there are more people who worship on Friday in Muslim mosque than all of the people who call themselves Christians worshiping on Sunday in churches. That's where it's gone. Of course, this is true of all of Western Europe, as reflected in the policies of the EU that I could go on about for a long time. Now, let's be candid about this. As seen in Muslim extremism, religious faith can indeed stifle freedom. But the Soviet experience and the political repression today in China remind us that militantly secularist cultures can also lead to a loss of liberty, and actually more loss of liberty. You engineers can tell me that every vacuum begs to be filled. Well, from a theological standpoint, an ethical standpoint, a moral standpoint, whenever there is a moral vacuum, it too begs to be filled. And what it's filled with, inevitably, is a kind of totalitarian faux morality, which is never as effective as the genuine article. When the Ten Commandments and fundamental moral laws are jettisoned, it takes countless rules and fundamental moral and regulations to achieve anything like the same social cohesion. And I think I'm going to be making something up here, so I don't even know what I'm talking about. But when natural law is abandoned, nothing is left but unnatural law. I've never consciously seen that phrase before, but it hit me when I was thinking about the demise of natural law. Well, what's left? Unnatural law. And natural law has as its reference a transcendent nature and nature's God, which is starting to get some play in the presidential debate. Unnatural law, whatever that might be, has only man as a reference point, leaving governments to pragmatism, utilitarianism, and raw political power. We divorce ourselves from natural law and I don't know how you can define that in all sorts of ways, by the way, but the law of nature and nature's God. You divorce law from that primary fundamental assumption, and we're in a whole different realm altogether. In Britain and in Europe, the rule of law, which Matt referenced in terms of the society and its concerns. In Britain and Europe, the rule of law, which assumes a transcendent higher law, has given way to the rule of rules. And there's a huge difference. The rule of law and the rule of rules, huge difference because of the underlying assumptions behind them. The rule of rules invites unabashed social, political, and economic engineering, which is never democratic but always and invariably autocratic. It relies on centralized authority exercised primarily by unelected bureaucrats, leads to excessive governmental meddling. It robs government of coherence, clarity, and most of all, restraint. For its own survival, secularist government is never neutral to religious faith, but necessarily hostile. As long as religious faith insists on absolute truth, no system denying absolute truth can maintain a pretense of legitimacy. And I think this is coming to bear more and more, that as long as religious faith is a mirror reflecting the immorality of popular social policy, that mirror, of course, must be shattered. Can't have that hanging about, can we? And I think the best example we have these days is gay marriage. The move for gay marriage is the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about here. Secularist government will never stop until the church itself is required to give its sanction to gay marriage. It's already seen in Britain in the firing of individual Christian registrars who have refused to participate in registering gay civil unions. And there are current proposals on the board to force the church to recognize such unions. Now, there's a grand irony here. Because religious freedom is the bedrock of all other liberty and freedoms, the elimination of religious freedom inevitably boomerangs on secularists themselves. A good illustration is the equality laws that they've enacted in Britain. They threaten free speech for everybody, even the secularist. It was left, ironically, to gay comedians. Do you know the comedian that is always talking, Rowan Atkinson, featured in the opening ceremonies at the Olympics? Rowan Atkinson is a very liberal-minded comedian, but it was left to gay comedians like him to rescue protections against hate speech laws recently proposed in Britain. For even gay comedians could have been under threat when poking fun at themselves while in drag. And they recognized that, and they said, come on, we can't have free speech taken away from us, even on an issue like homosexual activity. Now, if my fundamental premise is right, that the rise of secularism brings with it the fall of freedom, then I think we're pretty much doomed here in America. Just 2 days ago, I think it was, I saw this article in the Daily Telegraph by Damian Thompson. The strangest thing happened last week, he says, though few people noticed it. America officially ceased to be a Protestant country. According to the Pew Forum, the percentage of Protestants has dropped to 48%, down from 53% in 2007. That's a huge shift, he says. But before Catholics start punching the air, let me point out that the percentage of Catholics has been flatlining for years at 22%. The big jump is in unaffiliated Americans, including atheists, up from 15 to 20%. These nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as in none of the above, these nuns, as pollsters call them, are laying waste to the religious landscape of the United States. And then he adds, and Britain. You know, if Britain is a faithless Christian nation, we're headed in the same direction. For now, we're probably more an unfaithful Christian nation, if I can make that distinction, but we are headed toward a truly faithless nation, even in the Bible Belt, deep south. A younger generation will not just be more secular. They will be that. The younger generation will be more secular. But not just that. They will think differently. They will govern differently and practice law differently and write different legal opinions. Secularists think differently about all of life. Now, that's my basic premise, but I thought it might be interesting if I was sort of a meddler myself a bit here. I've looked at the Federalist Society's webpage and the statement taken from, quote, our purpose. And I have 3 statements that might find itself problematic, challenging in some respects. One of those is that debate leads us to the truth. And I know that the Federalist Society has been involved in lots of just excellent debates on issues of importance. But debate leads us to the truth. Well, this statement assumes what? That there is such a thing as the truth. But of course, secularism denies transcendent, capital T, truth. In a secular society, in particular, religious faith is privatized and reduced to mere opinion. So too political ideas and legal concepts. Just consider Justice Kennedy's notorious ode to personal autonomy in Casey, which fundamentally undermines the rule of law and slips the moorings of Kennedy's own warning elsewhere when he said elsewhere, "We must never lose sight of the fact that the law has a moral foundation, and we must never fail to ask ourselves not only what the law is, but what the law should be." I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But in the absence of fundamental morality and transcendent truth, all debate becomes a farce. To what authoritative or persuasive standard does any advocate possibly appeal? Here's a second sentence that I've taken from our purposes statement. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. I guess from Marbury versus Madison. I appreciate very much and agree with the sentiment of constitutional interpretation, and that's the key word, that honors both textual originalism and the separation of powers. But there's a danger in conceiving of law generally as either a kind of Holmesian realism or strict positivism unanchored from moral considerations. Secularists could not be happier allowing law to be merely what they choose it to be, rather than what by a higher law it ought to be. If the founders had not believed that law derived from what ought to be rather than what is, we never would have had the Constitution, which we insist should be interpreted according to what it says, rather than according to what some jurists insist that it ought to say. Typically, by the way, advancing secularist ideas, but happily borrowing the moralistic language of higher oughtness as if to acquire greater credibility. You may not be familiar with this. The engineers aren't going to be up to speed on this one. What do they know about anything ought? But consider, for example, Justice Blackmun's death penalty dissent in Callins v. Collins. To hear Blackmun speak, oh, it's all about morality, 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 even if his position has little or no moral support. And I think I can safely predict that when the same-sex marriage case is argued and decided, it will be considered completely off limits to argue the immorality of homosexual sex. But we will hear endless talk about the moral imperative of allowing homosexuals to marry. It'll be, you can't use it, but we can. And when they use it, it won't be moral. This brings me to the last of the statements. This entails reordering priorities within the legal system to place a premium on individual liberty, traditional values, and the rule of law. I'm just guessing that there's some fascinating dynamics within the Federalist Society, given your intriguing mix of libertarians and conservative traditionalists. I almost am tempted to ask for a waving of hands here. Which one of you would consider yourselves libertarians and which conservative traditionalists? I won't do that. In the death penalty debate, it is said that the closer you move toward the noble exercise of discretion in individual cases, the farther away you move from the equally noble goal of fairness across the board. Surely the same is true of those of us in this room. All of us are concerned about personal autonomy and any potential threat to its loss. All of us. We want as much individual liberty as possible. I'm just sure that's true of all of us in this room. But if my thesis is correct, an erosion of traditional faith-based assumptions will mean an erosion of individual liberty. And the conundrum is that traditional values necessarily place restraints on personal autonomy. They have to. They have to. This is why abortion and same-sex marriage are such hotly contested topics. In each case, libertarians would naturally be drawn to an individual's freedom to choose without government interference, while conservative traditionalists, who otherwise might agree with libertarians about individual freedom, believe that higher law trumps any liberal redefinition of either personhood for abortion or marriage in the case of same-sex marriage. The tension between individual liberty and traditional parenthetically, moral understandings about limitations on individual liberty is never easy to balance, but balance we must. In Britain, it is clear that the loss of traditional faith-based values has indeed led to greater individual liberty for many, but at the excessively high cost of a tyrannous curtailing of individual liberty for the vast majority of citizens. Perhaps then the Federalist Society is perfectly poised to show the way, demonstrating how to maintain the delicate tension between liberalism, individual liberty, traditional faith, and the individuality that would come from a libertarian perspective. Not to end on a negative note, which is to say, I'm going to end on a negative note. Not to end on a negative note, but my fear is that it matters little what advances the Federalist Society might achieve in the area of law and policy. If all around us, educational institutions, churches, families, and society succumb to the siren call of secularism, your battle will have been but a valiant holding action along an inevitable downward path from which there is no return. If the secularization of Britain tells us anything, here at home, nothing short of liberty and democracy is at stake. Right. Well, that was fast, and you enjoyed lunch, and I didn't. Matt, what do you
comment on one issue that hit?
Yeah, let's have some Q&A.
Let's talk about police today. I have a theory St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust for power. If you've ever been a member of a homeowners association, they want to dominate everyone.
Right.
Do you think it's just the natural tendency of people to be busybodies and run everybody's life, or is it more insidious than that?
The question is for the tape here, is it just sort of the natural tendency that everybody wants to be a busybody, or is it more than that? I think it's more than that, because if it's a natural tendency for that to happen, and it is, we still would not have seen the dramatic shift that we're seeing in the last couple of decades in Britain and that we're starting to see here, if it's just the nature for people to intermeddle. But here's where it really gets involved here. When you get into a rules-oriented society, which means you have bureaucrats, layers, multiple layers of bureaucrats, you have more people in official positions to be meddlers, to allow that natural tendency to meddle to come out and to be official. And that's what's happening in Britain, Europe, and of course here already in the States, much less to the extent that they've got it over there. We've already got it here, as you know. Yes? How do we solve it? We solve the thing, first of all, from my perspective, the perspective I'm trying to get out here today, by making sure that our culture does not any further go down this path to secularism. Because I'm thinking that that's the source of it all. We can tweak all we want to, but unless we are going back to the source of the problems, I think that our nation was founded really on these principles that law and society are dependent upon a recognition that there's a God and that He has certain divine laws that trickle down to our betterment, that righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people. If we could sort of get that there, then I think we trickle down to other concepts such as the freedom of individuals. In order to have the freedom of individuals who are made in the image of God, you cannot have people forcing them to do things. Well, big government always forces people to do things. So the next step is to limit government and to peel back the layers of that onion so that it doesn't stink like it usually does. With every additional layer, and parenthesis here, I'm not going to get into the whole Obamacare debate, but here's the problem that I will share with you from the perspective of someone who lives in England and has had a lot of experience with the NHS. Their biggest problem over there, which was begun not by labor, but by one of my heroines, Maggie Thatcher. It was Maggie Thatcher who came in to an ailing NHS and said, we've got to do something because it's bleeding funding. So she brought in CPAs and accountants, middlemen, to staunch the bleeding out of the NHS. And that bureaucracy did some good for a while, but then it just kept increasing. And that's what you're going to have with Obamacare over here. You're going to have that middle management, not the nurses, not the doctors, who are really providing the medical services, but it's going to be all the middle managers. And they're going to be bean counters. And they're going to say, we can't afford this operation or that operation. And you get into all the things over there with Britain now where they don't have enough beds to accommodate. I was so thrilled finally at the Olympic opening ceremony. How many of you watched that opening ceremony? Not many? Wow. Okay, but in any event, they had this most bizarre ode to the National Health Service. And out in the middle of the opening ceremonies, they had all these oversized beds that little kids were bouncing up and down on like they were trampolines. And you got to wonder, why would you have an ode to the NHS in the opening ceremonies? It was bizarre. But the second thing was, it answered at least one question for me. Where are all the beds in the hospitals in the NHS? They were there at the opening ceremonies. But honestly, we had a neighbor right next door in the cottage next door to us who fell and had to be taken to a local hospital. My wife Ruth rode with her to the hospital. Got to the hospital and they just stayed there for 30 minutes or an hour out in the parking lot. And there were other ambulances staying there out in the parking lot for 30 minutes or an hour. Well, what was that all about? Targets. Because the minute they took a patient through the door, the clock started ticking. And if you didn't meet the target of having a doctor see them within a certain amount of time, the funding didn't come to them that they would ordinarily get. And so it's all a pretense. They're all sitting out in the parking lot waiting for an opening so that a bed comes free. It's incredible. But I don't have any opinions about the NHS or Obamacare. But that's where the problem is going to come in, middle management. Yes?
By our very nature, we are a melting pot. Did our forefathers not foresee this? I mean, the real solution is we have people coming from different religious backgrounds. Those don't believe in God. I agree with everything you say, but I don't see an easy solution.
Yes, you had those who probably didn't believe in God, but you had mostly theist and deist. At least the deist acknowledged there was a God. And they didn't always agree on the details, but there was a fundamental understanding in the documents that we have. I mean, it's an amazing thing when we start talking about creator and being created equally and endowed with these, by our Creator with these fundamental rights. That's an amazing admission. About the same time, if you just want to look historically, in France, when they had their revolution, it was all about humans. It wasn't about God. And they had just a different perspective on government. And if you want to exchange what we have here with the French government, certainement, go for it. But I think you'll see a really fundamental difference in perspective. And we have accommodated. The problem we have not done, or not faced until this time, is the Muslim regime. And that's a whole different ballgame. That introduces Sharia law concepts and ideas about people who fundamentally, because of Sharia law is a non-accommodating belief system. We had an accommodating belief system, as you pointed out in your question. But the Muslim faith, right or wrong, they are not accommodating. In fact, they're subversive, and I'm not saying this in the sense of every individual Muslim is subversive. I'm just saying that the system is subversive in that when they see, and here it comes, folks, I mean, just look at this. Just look at this. The Muslim faith started off because Muhammad looked around him and he saw a secular society, if anything, paying lip service to idolatry, and so God is one. God is one. There's only one God, no idolatry, no secularism. So when they look to America and they see our secularism, they see our high divorce rate, they see our pornography, they see our immodesty, they see our homosexual toleration and so forth, all of that confirms to them that we are the great Satan, which only prompts them to say, we need to destroy that culture. It's all faith-driven for them. But we don't get it because we don't take our faith seriously like they take theirs seriously. And of course, I could go on and on. There's a difference fundamentally between the Muslim faith and the Christian faith as well, because they are a legalistic religion, whereas Christianity is a grace-oriented religion. And the difference between those two things is absolutely huge in terms of the implications. So we're coming into some forces that are huge and big. And what I'm really trying to say to those of you in the Federalist Society, I agree with basically what you're trying to do in the Federalist Society. But the issues that are being discussed in-house in our circles may not be the most important issues to be concerned about. I'm more concerned really today, I'll be very candid with you, about the church in America. And by that I just mean all churches in America. Because I think that the church itself has become secularized. And that most people who go to church, wear the name Christian, may read their Bibles, may say prayers, but at heart and soul, we're materialistic to the core. We do not order our lives principally by a concern about higher matters, about faith and so forth. And I think a younger generation, again, is leaving the church by droves because they're not being called to a Christian faith, they're being called to just another form of secularism. And when that happens, the whole society, the fabric of society unravels around us while we're arguing, should a judge stick to the Constitution or not? And I'm agreeing. They ought to stick to the Constitution or change it by the process in the Constitution. But that's going to mean very, very little when all around us society goes into deterioration. That's my concern. Big issues.
One of the problems that the framers didn't authorize judicial review, that was seized, and then you go through these acrobatics that Hugo Black did to expel religion from the school.
I know, it's a sort of a catch-22, that if you don't honor the Constitution, it's going to lead to circumstances which are bigger than the Constitution itself. They were smart people back there. They had their heads screwed on right. But today, it's like we're oblivious both in-house to the constitutional concerns and certainly outside the house to all the social concerns. Again, I'm not really worked up about this, but I'm very serious. I think I don't want to come across as a pessimist and ruin your lunch, but we've got major issues. And the other interesting thing is that tonight in the debate, those issues won't even come close to being part of the discussion. And they can't be. They can't be, because we are already at the tipping point. We're already past the tipping point of being such a secular society that we can't have that conversation. We just can't even have the conversation. And so, as I tell my law students, my criminal law students, I said, here we are learning about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. Searches and seizures, what may the police do, what may the police not do, and that's all well and good, but we're not addressing the problems of poverty, race, divorce, families, all the things that put people into the situation where these 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rules are going to apply. We just don't even think about those. And nobody else is seriously thinking about all those issues. Well, I mean, there are some people who say, if you just put a little more money in the educational kitty, we won't have crime. And that's not true either. That's sort of the liberal solution to it. Just throw money at it. Just throw money at it. We've been doing that for years, and that's not the problem, or not the solution to the problem. It's these larger issues of who are we? Who are we? Are we created beings? Are we evolved beings? I have a whole chapter in the Obama book here that seems out of place, but I'm just sure, well, of course, I am sure because I put it there, but I'm just sure that it is key to this thing that we have not taken on the issue, the most fundamental issue of all, and that is, where did we come from? We bought off on the notion that because we can observe some kinds of evolution within species, that it comes from, amoeba to man, and somehow or another, we who are Christians say, well, God created the heavens and the earth, but of course He did it through natural selection, which is nuts, because if He did it, at all, by whatever process, it wouldn't be natural selection, it'd be supernatural selection. And how do you fit the soul that we say in our funerals? I went to a funeral Sunday of a person who had killed himself. How do you deal with the soul that we say is going to live beyond this life if it sort of happened through a closed naturalistic system like that?
We have to define what consciousness is.
Yeah, but I just think that our whole religious fundamental background has to be thought through, and I've really tried to work through some of those issues, by the way, to help people who say, well, what are we going to do with the scientific part of it? Well, I try to help you out on that. And people talk about the missing link. I'll tell you one just to think about for a moment.
It's actually in my courtroom right now.
Yeah, exactly. But the missing link is not a monkey or an ape or a near atom or anything like that. The missing link in evolution, truly, is the missing sex link. You think about that for a minute. Because if you start off with asexual beings, at some point in time, they've got to become sexual beings and reproduce sexually, not asexually. Well, how's that going to work? I mean, if you think in terms of whether it's humans or animals, whatever it is, the sexual reproduction, it takes a male and a female, and male organs and female organs, male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs. And so you get into one generation. It all has to happen because half of a uterus, half of a penis isn't going to get us there to the next generation. And they're complicated organs. They've got to develop instantly in one generation at the same time, in the same place, and they have to be attracted to one another. And just little issues like that are just above the fray. We just assume things that we just shouldn't assume. There's problems here. And it's not just a technical religious kind of thing. It affects every bit of this secularization that I've been talking about. Wow, I feel, we're going to take up a collection after this, or have an altar call or invitation song or anything.
Somebody more cynical than I am.
Yeah. Well, it's 1:30, and I thank you for your patience.